Welcome to the MIT SSP Wednesday seminar. I'm Taylor Fravel, director of the MIT Security Studies program. Today, I'm really delighted to welcome Jaganath Sankaran from the LBJ School at the University of Texas in Austin, a place known very well to many of us here. He is an assistant professor of public affairs and a non-resident fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution. He spent the first 4 years of his career as a defense scientist with the Indian Missile R&D establishment. He's held fellowships at the U.S. Air War College, the Congressional Budget Office, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the Belfer Center down the road. He's also served on study groups of the National Academies of Sciences and the American Physical Society panel on public affairs examining missile defenses and strategic stability. His work has been widely published in outlets such as International Security, Contemporary Security Policy, the Journal of Strategic Studies, among many others that you can find on his website. So today he's going to talk about bombing to provoke, rockets, missiles, and drones as instruments of fearing coercion. Jaganath, welcome to MIT.
All right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Taylor. I'm probably going to get the introductory clip and then send it to my tenure committee. And you know what? Hey, Taylor, look at what he says. Right? I mean, should add more weight. Anyway, thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here to talk about what I argue in my book and how I do it. Where I pose the question, how do aerospace weapons work as instruments of provocation and coercion in war? How do weak actors employ these weapons to provoke and bargain with stronger adversaries? Right? That's the question, and I will jump into it very soon. But before I do that, let me provide some context to how the book came about. So you'll all be nice to me. I am what you'd call an accidental political scientist. Right? I was choosing between using the words an accidental political scientist or an accidental approximation to a political scientist. Right? 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, I landed at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and I was hoping to do a Ted Postal, do a Steve Fetter, do a Ash Carter, and then I ran into this very small problem. Right? It's a minor problem which you're all familiar with. It's called the tenure process. Right? It's a minor process. So I was told, oh, you need a home department, and you're either an engineer or a political scientist. And I said, you know what, I'm too resistant to be an engineer. I'll be a political scientist. And they said, well, in that case, you need to write a political science-like book. Right? And so in the crucible of that process was how this book emerged, much quicker than I would have liked to have spent the time. This wasn't a dissertation to a book. This was a book to survive. Right. So I think I can answer most of your questions, but there may be some questions I may not be able to answer as satisfactorily. So what I will do in the roughly next 45, 50 minutes is talk about my book. But I'm going to talk about the book in the same way that I thought and I wrote the book, because I thought that it would be more fun than what the book says. So, okay, what did I do? Oh, there you go. In my search in looking for a puzzle to the book, I want to write something about missiles. And I landed up on the 1991 Gulf War, right? So this is this fascinating image that I borrowed from the Imperial War Museum. Depending on who you ask, this is the Patriot missile battery spectacularly shooting down Saddam Hussein's Scud, or spectacularly failing to shoot down and exploding on itself, right? I mean, we don't know. Who do you ask? And Ted Postal would say this is a sign of failure, right? I mean, that's how he wrote his IS article. Okay, so the 1991 Gulf War is interesting in terms of identifying a puzzle, right? If you asked, and if you started interrogating, how did military leaders, how did analysts looking at the Scud missile as a weapon of war, as a weapon of provocation and coercion, evaluated the missile, you'd very soon get to this kind of an argument. This was Chuck Horner, who ran the Air Force Command during the 91 Gulf War. He called the Scud on record militarily insignificant. Right? Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the commander-in-chief of the coalition forces, is even more explicit, right? It is a piss-and weapon, it isn't doing a goddamn thing, it is insignificant, it is useless, right? And this message keeps repeating again and again, before, during, and after the war. The evaluation is very consistent. Militarily speaking, from a perspective of military denial, kinetic effect, the weapon doesn't matter. And Schwarzkopf doesn't stop there, right? I mean, in his book, he has this nice description of what he thinks about Saddam Hussein's Scud. And he says, well, when the Israelis are saying this weapon is a big threat to us, that's like saying lightning is a danger to a nation, right? And then he goes on to say, I'd be more afraid of standing in the streets of Atlanta when there's a lightning storm than I would be in the streets of Tel Aviv and Riyadh, because the scuds are so bad it won't do a damn thing. And he doesn't stop there. He actually has a very technical kind of analysis where he says, well, what they have, the Iraqis, Saddam Hussein, is a weapon that can fly 300 miles, miss the target by a couple of miles with a warhead of 160 pounds, which by is not a lot of kill vehicle. It's the military equivalent of a single airplane flying haphazardly over, dropping one small bomb and flying away. Terrible for that one unlucky individual on whose head the bomb falls, if it so does, but in the grand scheme of things, a mosquito. Again, the central message is it doesn't matter, right? And he's not right to say, he's not wrong to say so, right? Because this argument has a inbuilt analytical framework, right? So the framework is something like this. Here you're all sitting in this nice building listening to me. And if I had Saddam Hussein's Scud and if I wanted to blow this building up, all right, there you go. Right? Because I looked around. I mean, sometimes hitting the roof may not be the smart idea, right? You need to come at an angle. That's right. Well, I had no clue, but hey, I'm targeting the entire building, right? I mean, it's just maybe the center of gravity may be somewhere else. All right. So if this is what I want to do, this is where the missile would land. So this is a 1 kilometer, approximately 0.5 mile circular error problem. Right? If I had one of Saddam Hussein's Scud and I had the authority to launch it and be naughty, right? I mean, there's a 50% chance somewhere in this circle is where the missile would land. That's a terrible accuracy, right? It really can't do much damage. Where I want to be is around here. If I assume I have, say, 500 kilogram payload filled with TNT, and I want to create, say, 4 to 5 psi overpressure, I really have to be on top of the building to collapse a well-built building, right? So this is where I'll be. This is where I end up. This is where I should be. In essence, the evaluation that Schwarzkopf and other military leaders make throughout the war is correct. Right? It's not a military denial instrument. It's actually not a powerful instrument in any meaningful way. You can't predictably have a lot of destruction using these weapons, right? But here's where the puzzle, the story gets interesting. Decision makers, political decision makers, on the other hand, had a very different story to tell in the course of the 91 Gulf War. Right? President George H.W. Bush promised Israeli President Shamir that he would execute the darndest search and rescue effort to destroy and suppress the Scud missiles. This promise was made even though he was aware of how the military felt about it. Right? And then this is where archival work is so much fun. Dick Cheney, again, has this nice conversation he has with, so this is a Pentagon room conversation. I believe this is day 6 of the 91 Gulf War. Dick Cheney has seen the air tasking order for the morning, and then he walks into the room where Colin Powell is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he says, God damn it, I want some coverage. I don't care what you think the threat is, as long as I'm the Secretary of Defense, you will do as I tell you to do. If I want you to put more planes to hunt Scuds, you will do it. It doesn't matter what you think the actual threat is. Right? And this conversation goes back and forth, and Colin Powell tries to play the middleman between Schwarzkopf, Honor, and the Secretary of Defense. And then he gets really angry. This is Dick Cheney getting really angry. And then he uses this. this is really, I mean, you want to think about being provoked in an archival setting, and this is as clear as it gets, right? He yells at Colin Powell and says, well, I want some effing airplanes out there, right? Do it. You do it because I tell you to do it. It doesn't matter what you think. In other words, the weapon had a distinct provocative effect, right? We were provoked to respond for a set of specific reasons. And this doesn't stop. This story goes back all throughout the war. There is the Scud Thursday incident, which is this nice story, and then several other instances. By the end of the war, there is this huge, massive attritional diversionary effort, attritional diversionary military effort that is taken to suppress the Scud, even though a purely military tactical assessment would say that's not required. So we did approximately 2,500 anti-Scud sorties. That number exceeded the number of sorties that were undertaken for a variety of missions. 1,370 was the number of sorties we did for surface-to-air missile batteries. 1,170 was the number of sorties that was taken against communication assets. And 970 was the number of sorties we did targeting nuclear, chemical, biological weapons facilities. Right. Now, that wasn't sufficient. At some point, there were 400 Delta commandos that were sent into Iraq to hunt Scuds. I believe the British sent the special ops forces too. That was 60 or 70. Around 10 died in the process of hunting for the Scuds. Brent Scowcroft, who has this oral history of his experience of the 91 Gulf War, calls the entire effort singularly unsuccessful and was done entirely for a political reason, which is to appease the Israelis to keep them out of getting involved in the war. And then there's a whole bunch of other efforts that goes on, right? So this weapon, this puissant weapon, has this huge political effect, right? That's the provocation aspect of it. But it's not an accident. It's not a one-off thing, right? I mean, if you go back and again look at the 91 Gulf War, there is a puzzle that forms. And Saddam Hussein explicitly attempts to trigger this particular reaction from American decision makers, right? From the beginning of the war, he makes a very clear threat. I will use my missiles and I will probably lob chemical weapons into Israel. Right? I will burn half of Israel. And then Tariq Aziz, who is his foreign minister, tells Howard Baker, who's then the Secretary of State, it doesn't matter who fires the first shot, we will fire our first missile into Israel. Right? And so this is an explicit threat that Saddam Hussein makes to weaponize fear and make the Israelis feel vulnerable. Right? Now, the Israelis haven't declassified a whole bunch of data or a whole bunch of records, but they've somehow declassified images, and these are some of those declassified images of Israeli war room, and I think this is a civilian home where they were fearing chemical weapons. I think the threat of chemical weapons recedes from the early stages of the war, but it never goes away. And Saddam Hussein is very astute in trying to use that potential threat to provoke the Americans into overreacting. And again, this isn't random. So he essentially says, I will lob chemical weapons, I will attack Israel. And then in a conversation with the American ambassador to Kuwait, April Glaspie, he says, I will do this because you as society, as an Americans, cannot take a casualty of 10,000. I can take 100,000. Right? It doesn't matter how many missiles you fire into Baghdad. If I fire one into Israel, that works for me because I'm expecting you to be pressured into starting your war quickly, because Israel would enter the war if you don't. And if you come in quickly, I'm going to impose casualty. And by imposing casualty, I can bargain. So that is his mechanism. So this isn't a random event. Saddam Hussein is very tactical in how he thinks as a weak actor. He could use these missiles to provoke a reaction from the US, which would be the counter force and the defensive aspects, but also accelerate the timeline, which then he hopes would weaken its resolve and lead to a bargained outcome. Now, that's his plan, and the Israelis, of course, react exactly like he thinks they would. So there's this one statement that's made at the United Nations, I believe, about how Israelis would respond, and they do it consistently. We can't be hit. We cannot take one missile strike because it would forever alter the moral and psychology. It's in our DNA. There's another statement that says it's in Israel's DNA to respond with overwhelming force for any threat against us. So the Saddam Hussein's threat matches very closely with the Israeli sense of vulnerability. All right. Let me see where I am. And this again continues throughout the war. Again, it's a lot of fun in the archives to pull this up. There's this conversation midway through the 91 Gulf War where we've already sent Patriot batteries. We're doing all this aerial bombardment to suppress Kurds. And the Israeli Defense Minister, Moshe Aarons, is in the White House. And then there's Dick Cheney and a whole bunch of others. And then he makes this same. There's a feeling in Israel that we are at war, right? It didn't matter that Israel was not at war. The emotional response was, we feel like we are at war. And then he says 31 Scuds have been launched, some killed. Oh, by the way, at that point in time, there was one Israeli death. By the end of the war, there were 2 Israeli deaths from the direct missile attack. So the numbers were very trivial. It's the perception that does a lot of heavy lifting here. And he says, well, we feel like we should retaliate. We feel like we should get into the war. Can you please deconflict the airspace so we can come in, right? And President Bush, in all diplomatic ways, says pass, right? Not going to happen. So this conversation goes back and forth. At one point, Dick Cheney gives a note to President Bush saying, "Oh, our Patriot missile defense systems are 95% accurate," and again, those are all in the archives. And, Ted Postel may have a view on that at some point. So they keep back and forth, and he says, "I'm doing everything conceivable. What more do you want me to do it? You tell me how to do it, and I'll go do it." Right? Again, this is this open-ended promise that he makes, and then at that point, Moshe says, "Well, I don't want to be presumptuous, but we feel like Israeli bombs should be falling on Saddam Hussein's rockets, not American bombs." Right? Again, we need to respond. We need to show our people that we need to respond, and then essentially he gets overruled. But he sends this huge list of, I think, 75 bridges in Iraq and culverts and other stuff that they want to be bombed. This is in excess to everything that was already being bombed. And that list, with much protest, gets pushed down into the Air Force, who again come back and say, well, this is dumbass idea. Who came up with this list? I mean, I've put in the sanitized version, but it's pretty much what they say is, we can't have a bunch of Israelis telling us, how to run this campaign. We're already doing so much. Why are we endangering pilot lives? But that didn't matter for President Bush, right? Because he had to respond, because the Iraqis were very successful in provoking the Israelis into laying that pressure on the American administration. So this is the puzzle, right? This is this fascinating story that I picked up on the 91 Gulf War. And I said, well, if the weapons are so irrelevant, all of this shouldn't have happened, right? But we did this huge effort. This was in one plane dropping one bomb on a Scud truck. This was this massive diversion that was tactfully provoked. It did not lead to coercion in this particular example, but it was very significant. And so there's a story to be told. And then I jump into, well, okay, right? So there's a nice story, but I wasn't trying to be an historian. I was trying to be a political scientist. So I need a theoretical level, right? So what does this story tell me more about air power? And this was exceedingly challenging, and it took a lot of work. Here is Bob Pape, right, on air power theory. Right off the bat, he's very clear. There is no such thing as punishment campaign. It doesn't work. Military denial is the way to go. Right? Now, Saddam Hussein wasn't doing military denial, so either he was profoundly stupid or he had something else in his mind. Right? I mean, so what is the something else if it wasn't a bad choice? So luckily for me, if you read Bob Pape's book twice, thrice, 5 times, right? I mean, there are 2 nice escape hatches he leaves in his theory, right? The first escape hatch is this. The assumption is that air superiority is a given for air power theory. In other words, his argument is, once you have air superiority, the central question is what to attack after that air superiority is secured. And his entire theory is premised on this notion that you can, in fact, attain and keep air superiority. That wasn't true with Saddam Hussein. Right? I mean, in fact, the story there is Saddam Hussein's Air Force that looked spectacularly good on paper with MiG-29s, Su-24s, French Mirage jets, went out of business within hours. 75 of its jets ran off to Iran. Right? So he didn't have air superiority. And without air superiority, maybe these aerospace weapons, in his case missiles, were doing a lot of the work what an air power or a air power with Air Force would do, trying to provoke and force a conflict on its own terms. Right? And then there is a second escape hatch that Bob Pape kindly leaves for me to sneak through. His argument is punishment strategies will rarely succeed, with one exception: when core values are not at stake. Now, I word searched the book up, down, and sideways multiple times. This is the only instance where core values is mentioned. So core values is what you think it is. Right? But the argument there is, in his example, in all those cases, there was core value at play. So if core value is not at play, then maybe punishment terror campaigns can do some work. Right? They can maybe coerce and secure limited concession, which is the argument I make. The example from my book for that would be the Houthis and the Saudis fighting over Yemen. Missiles, drones do a lot of work here. Ultimately, the Saudis say enough is enough. I had my fun. I have to now negotiate. Right? The argument there is that that happened because there was no core value. The Saudis could go back to their country without having to worry about what it means for the security, even if Yemen stays in the hands of the Houthis. So the core value assumption, the air superiority assumption, both kind of give me some space to talk about how aerospace weapons, rockets, missiles, and drones can still work as weapons of provocation and coercion. So those were the theoretical space that I needed. And then there is this entire interesting subset of how historians have looked at air power theory. And I'd have to say, it is not fun for those who subscribe to the Bob Pape school. And I learned it a little late in the book writing process. The way I think about this, and I tell my classes, it's like a really fat sumo wrestler dropping down on its victim. Right? I mean, historians really don't like the argument that air power is purely coercion but not punishment. This is Richard Overy, who says the argument that punishment means nothing is fundamentally implausible. The strategic air offensive was one of the most decisive elements in Allied victory. Right? And he isn't alone. There's a whole bunch of people who have made that argument, right? Who say, well, punishment campaigns really are not that trivial. And the way they do it is they reframe the question. From asking, did air power directly lead to victory? The question becomes, how did air power influence the course of war? Right? If you shift the question, then the answer becomes a lot more interesting for air power, and particularly for missiles, rockets, and drones. Now, I don't want to take any sides on the historian political science divide, right? But what I would say is, like all good academics, I stole the framing from these people, right? And I repurposed it. So the book, again, asks the question, whether aerospace bombardment influenced the course of war and how so, right? So 91 Gulf War, if you pose this question, then yes, it did influence the war, right? It didn't win Saddam the war, but he thought he could use it to bargain in the war to his advantage. And so having after struggle and reframing the question, I make four big arguments in the book, and I will lay out those arguments, and then I will give you one more empirical case study, and I'll close down. One of the arguments I make is that weak actors, whether they are state or non-state actors, should explicitly attempt to provoke and bargain using aerospace weapons to weaponize fear, to trigger a sense of vulnerability and defenselessness among the targeted population. In essence, this is terrorism. Right? And I borrow a lot from the terrorism literature and the provocation argument to make this thing. They will use these weapons like how suicide bombers tend to use their terrorism strategy. Right? It should provoke an emotional response in the targeted state, right? And the emotional response can be of several kinds, but in the terrorism literature and in the literature that relates emotions to IR, fear is one of those emotions, right? And when you're operating under fear, two things happen. Your appraisal tendency and your action tendency shift. That's the psychological insight that feeds from emotion into IR. So the state or non-state actor, the weak actor trying to use the weapon should try to use it as a tool of terrorism. It should provoke an emotional response, and states, when subject to such aerospace bombardment, should overestimate the vulnerability of the threat. Right? Their appraisal tendencies get skewed. Even though objectively the threat may be minor, they should worry that it could do a lot more damage, and that should reflect in how they talk about the threat. It should also alter their action tendencies, the fight, freeze, flight response. The fight response should be very active. In other words, even if the threat is objectively limited, they should be willing to undertake a significant attritional and diversionary campaign to suppress the threat. Right? If it works as an emotional trigger, I should see both an appraisal and action tendency that would not fit in a linear logical model. So those were the things I was testing in each of the case studies. And the last argument I would make is, when does provocation lead to coercion? When the ability to defend, suppress the threat does not exist. If I observe a dilution in resolve, I can see some effort at offering concessions. So what I do is I look at 5 case studies. I talked about the 91 Gulf War. The 3 case studies in red are the ones where I argue that there is some evidence of limited concession. Right? It's not outright victory, as air power theorists would usually frame it. It's very limited concession. In Saudi Arabia's case, it's like, oh, we now think the Houthis have a role to play in the future of Yemen. In the Iran-Iraq war, I think there's some concession. In the 2006 Lebanon war, again, I think there is evidence of concession. World War II, 1991 Gulf War, provocation is clearly evident. Coercion doesn't happen. Right? Both of those actors using missiles are defeated. I talked about the 91 Gulf War. I'm going to talk about the World War II for the next few 10-15 minutes, just because it's a lot more fun case to talk about. The Houthis are the third most fun, but World War II, again, there's so much data and there's so much dynamics you can actually observe. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I will wrap up my conversation. All right. So R.V. Jones is the guy who is given responsibility for the British scientific technical analysis. I can't remember if he's an engineer or a physicist, but I'm going to assume he's an engineer, right? Because I'm an engineer. Right? So he collects all this information, intelligence data on what the Germans are doing, and he is the lead for reinterpreting the Oslo report, which is this huge spy report on what the Germans were doing in 1939 that they receive on what's happening. And so he has this book after the war, where he has this fantastic statement, right? He says, British politicians were far more frightened by 1 ton of explosive delivered by rocket than by 5 tons delivered by aircraft. Right? It's not the tonnage, it's the mechanism. And he says, it's one of the biggest scares in history, right? And his argument of why one of the biggest scares in history happened was, and he talks about, there's this romantic notion of what missiles can do we have in our head that provokes a certain reaction. And he wouldn't be wrong. And R.V. Jones is one of those skeptics who thought the German V1, V2 missiles were not that good. Right? I mean, again, there's this divide between the British political class on what the weapons can do. And there's this huge amount of data and how they kept talking about it. The kind people at the British Archives let me go there during COVID and pull up this whole series of documents. So this one is the effect of crossbow on overlord. Crossbow is the operation undertaken to suppress and bomb the German V1, V2. Overlord is the operation that was used for landing on the beaches of Normandy, right? So they're trying to evaluate what this all means. And there is this I know this is annoying to read, right? But laziness is a virtue, and I didn't want to type, so I cut and I pasted it, right? I mean, but it also looks very authentic, right? So this is an evaluation of what German V1 and V2 can do, right? Buried in all this evaluation is there is this fantastic estimation, and this is 1940, right? Before 40, late 40s, I presume. They do an estimation of what the German V1 can V2, and they do an evaluation of how accurate the missile is, right? Remember when I talked about Saddam Hussein and 0.5 miles accurate? German V1, V2 were estimated, well, V1 is a little higher. V2 was estimated at 7.5 miles, right? So remember this nice figure when I was trying to, target Dr. Fravel's office with the Saddam Hussein Scud. So this is what Saddam Hussein Scud would have done. This is what V1, V2 would have done, right? So I'm still in Cambridge. I don't know if I'm still in Boston, right? I mean, or in the state. I'm outside Boston, right? Yeah. So this is what Saddam Hussein's V1 and V2 would do, right? You can very quick, so they determine the CEP based on their spy data, or the data that was captured from Peenemund experiments, and they have this number, you put the number on a map, and it really doesn't appear threatening, right? But that's not what the British decided it was, right? Because again, they have this argument, and they frame the question very differently, right? And there's an entire committee of experts, including they have their own Minister for Home Security. I don't know. Anyway, the British have their own framing, right? But they have this nice committee called the Finlayter-Stewart Committee, whose only purpose is to figure out how much of a threat the German V2 missiles would be, right? They very clearly decide at the outset, the question wasn't whether the weapon was relevant. The question was what was the most likely thing the enemy could do with the weapon, right? The framing itself mattered. The framing wasn't that this weapon was technically irrelevant. We are fighting a war for survival. We shouldn't do anything. The framing was, well, given this weapon, what could they have possibly done? And this is all back and forth. They were talking about, well, can they fire it at the ports at Southampton so we can't do the Normandy landing? Can they fire it at London? And they go back and forth, and mathematically what comes out to be a 1 potato, 2 potato method, they say, London's the target. Not because it's highly accurate, because, well, that seems to be, it seems to be an area denial weapon, so they're going to shoot at London, right? Okay, and so this again does the whole thing that I talked about in the 91 Gulf War. There's this huge diversionary effect, which in principle shouldn't have happened. The 91 Gulf War, you can imagine it happening because we had enormous resources. This was at a point of time in war where the resources were curtailed. We had very limited resources, and there was a choice made to take resources away from bombing German industrial targets to bombing German V1, V2 targets. Right? So again, before Normandy, before the landing of troops on the French coast, there's huge amount of effort. 40% of Allied reconnaissance missions, and these were all airplane reconnaissance, right? 40s was used to observe these V1, V2 targets. So that would be Peenemund, and then these key sites, the launch sites, they had built at various points on the French coast. Operation Hydra was the air bombing effort they took to destroy the Peenemund missile testing facility. And then at one point in time, this was the most comprehensive effort at aerial counterforce at that point in time. 1,300 aircraft dropping 1,700 tons of bombs on 23 sites that were exclusively used for launching the missiles, right? Again, 1,700 looks very trivial now that we see what Israel can do. Remember, this was 50 years ago, and 1,700 was a huge effort, right? So there's this huge effort going on that diverts resources. And there's this nice op-ed piece in New York Times that talks about what this means at that point in time for the Allied effort to defeat the Nazi regime, right? The word diversionary that I keep using, the attritional diversionary effect, this is where I stole that from, right? I mean, when people are doing work for you, say thank you, and then, get it, right? So Germans have now created this massive diversion, right? The threat, at this point, not a single missile has been flown into London. It's highly skeptical information, and that information does not suggest that the threat is highly accurate. But the threat had succeeded in lightening the weight of attack upon Germany. to the extent that no two planes, two bombs can be at one place. They had this massive diversion going on. And the Germans, if you go back to their archives, essentially say the same thing. Adolf Galland, who ran the Luftwaffe, who was a commander on the Luftwaffe, says 1/4 of the pre-Normandy bombing efforts were diverted from German troops onto V1 and V2 targets. And he says, even if the missiles were irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, the diversion was a significant breathing space for the Germans. So they think that, and we thought that, and Hitler is also on record saying that, right? Okay. Again, if this was a propaganda, it was a most successful propaganda of how Germans did this, and until there is clear evidence that the weapon isn't as formidable as we think it is, we have to assume it's formidable, right? Again, there's a psychological explanation to it. Unless I know for absolutely sure London isn't going to burn, I'm not going to assume the weapon is irrelevant. Even though an analysis would say at 7.5 miles, you may as well fire the weapon in the opposite direction, hope it lands on London, right? Again, there's this story unfolding similar to the Gulf War of how decision makers worried, made worst case assumptions and presumed the weapon's going to be a threat, right? But not everyone agreed with it, right? Again, the military leaders were saying, well, hold your horses, back it up. I mean, the number says 7.5 miles. Why do you think it's a big threat? And again, the 91 Gulf War story unfolds. It unfolds in all the case studies, but the World War II, again, there's enough evidence to capture that in detail. General Spaatz, who is the commander of US strategic air forces in Europe, says it's an inspired fight. There is no real threat. We shouldn't be wasting our bombs on these German V1 and V2. Spaatz and Arnold, who write a memo to Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander, saying, well, this is a dumbass idea to go bomb German V1 and V2 sites. I don't have enough resources to do overlord and point blank. Why are you forcing me to do something that doesn't mean much for the war? Overlord is, again, the operation to land Allied troops on the Normandy coast. Point blank is part of the CBO, the bombing operation to target German industries. Right? So these two essentially say, I don't have the resources. You're making me choose between what's valuable for war and what may be a threat, because the British fear, oh, this may be an issue, right? And again, there's this entire story that unfolds. Now, the British keep demanding more and more American bombing efforts, and so Spaatz really doesn't like the idea. So he builds an entire replica of the German ski sites in the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and they do a trial run of bombings. Do I use fighters at low altitude or do I use bombers at high altitude? And they do multiple things. They write a nice report that says you should use fighters at low altitude, because you'd have much higher accuracy. This is the 1940s, right? And then he then goes to the British Air Chief Marshal Mallory and says, oh, we don't need American bombers to do this. Your Air Force should do it, right? I mean, your fighters should go fly. And he says, no, I don't want my fighters to do it. What if they get shot? Right? I think the Americans should do it. You should use your bombers. Right? And so this argument comes to Eisenhower, and he says, well, this is all good argument, but if the Prime Minister of Britain, Churchill, tells me he feels London is the target, and he says, I have to put some bombers on it, I'm going to put some bombers on it. And these weren't trivial numbers. There was this massive effort before Normandy that goes on, and there's all this conversation that goes back and forth. And yeah, this is the request from Churchill via the British War Cabinet Secretary to Eisenhower to go and bomb the launch sites of the German V1 and V2. Right? Again, there's this nice story about Churchill trying to do a Dick Cheney, right? But his curse words aren't that much fun. Right? I mean, he wants to do chemical weapon attacks on German cities. And he has this notion about, well, I'll destroy one city and I'll bargain now with them. You stop your missiles, I'll stop destroying the next city. And his entire cabinet says, well, chemical weapons are a bad idea. They're not effective. We don't want to do the first ones to do it. And then he uses the word parsons, right, to yell at his cabinet. Every time I have to go look back at the dictionary to say what it means. And I can't remember it now, right? I mean, you parsons, you don't want to do anything, risky and all that. So anyway, Churchill says to Eisenhower, you need to go bomb these sites. It happens, and it continues happening throughout the war. Right? The story keeps unfolding again and again. So after Normandy, again, Churchill talks about the V1 and V2, and he says it's more problematic to me than the Blitz that happened in 1940. Analytically speaking, that wasn't true, right? The Blitz had much more higher level of bomb, much more higher level of casualties. But here's Churchill in his book says, oh, it was hugely emotionally straining, right? And at least the folks of London responded in a similar way. 1.5 million had left London, productivity had fallen, and the story again happens. There is a direct request from the combined chiefs of staff to Eisenhower that you need to go again bomb the V1, V2 sites, even though the threat was trivial. And again, for the 2 months after the Normandy landing, it takes a huge effort to destroy all these sites. And this is just the counter force. The defensive operation is equally huge. And this is a World War II tracer fire from anti-aircraft fire trying to shoot down incoming V2s. And this is the image, again, I repurposed from my book. During the Blitz, the British built this huge defensive barrier, a first layer of fighters with radars, a second layer with anti-aircraft artillery, a third layer with the balloons, which would take up some of the incoming fighters. And so they take it down after the Blitz and rebuild the entire system, spending millions of dollars in the middle of this war to defend against the V1 and V2. Right? The fact that the V1 and V2 threat wasn't as potent was not as important to how Churchill and the folks of London felt, and they had to recreate this whole diversionary effort to defend against V1 and V2 missiles. The provocative effect in World War II is very clear. It doesn't stop, it goes on and on. Here is a Field Marshal Montgomery is the guy who, he and General Patton were the two people who were trying to find two axes to invade into Germany after the troops were in. And the choice was that whether they should go along with General Patton's plan to invade into German industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, or do they need to go into Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and from one or two missiles from those sites end up in London. And again, there's a telegram saying, you need to cordon off these areas. And that essentially makes the choice between those two operations. And Eisenhower essentially says Field Marshal Montgomery's thrust into Germany through Amsterdam is the way to go. Right? And again, a redirection of troops. Operation Market Garden was entirely motivated by that decision to not go directly into the German heartland, but to get hold of Amsterdam first and then move into it. Again, this huge effort that I observed throughout the war. Right? So 91 Gulf War, World War II. Again, this is a fascinating story of how provocation happens, right? How this weapon, which in principle could not, as a tool of military denial, do much as a tool of provocation, as a tool of terrorizing punishment, does a whole bunch of work in provocating the targeted state to respond with a diversionary and a attritional military campaign. Now, in both those cases, the coercion is zero, right? But as I said at the beginning, I want to tell a story of how much it mattered rather than purely if it mattered at the end or not. So 91 Gulf War, World War II, coercion was zero. But the other three case studies that I mentioned, the Iran-Iraq War, the 2006 Lebanon War, and the Houthis and Saudis, the recent conflict, there are significant evidence of concessions being made. Right? But because there is no much time left, I will not talk about those case studies. I will wrap it up here, and then we can have a Q&A conversation. Right? So, yeah.
Thank you. So as you know, our drill is I'll keep a running list of questions. Please raise your hand. I realize we have some guests from Pony. You're welcome to join the conversation as well. Dan.
Hi, I'm Daniel Siegel, a third-year grad student. Thank you for this presentation. I'm a bit curious, so I'm trying to understand what's your DV, what's your IV here. So from my understanding from your talk, the DV seems to be this decision from the provokers to do a punishment or denial strategy. But then a lot of the presentation, you're talking about how that decision affected the response. So are you most interested in, why do aggressors choose to use a sort of punishment strategy, or are you more interested in then how that affects how people respond to their military strategy? And then what's actually driving that? I just don't really know. Talk a lot about whether there's a political pressure to do certain responses. So is that a key inherent variable for you? Can you just like talk a bit more in structure about what the theory really is trying to describe besides the utility of provocation?
So the big question I want to explain was how are the targeted states responding? I mean, I do engage with a question on how are the states, non-state actors using these weapons. What are they thinking? But my big question was how are they responding and why are they responding in this particular way? Right? Because the context would have been that the prevailing literature is saying, well, first these weapons are useless and therefore you should not respond at all. Right? So 91 Gulf War, the argument would have been, well, everything is being done to suppress it. All you have to do is stay in your shelters. Why were the Israelis so worried? Why were they forcing us to do counterforce? And that's what I'm trying to explain in the book. All right. And the argument I make is they respond in this way because it's an emotional reaction. Right? It's like suicide terrorism. Right? I mean, why do states lash out in response to suicide terrorism? Because it's an emotional response. They evaluate, there's a political need to respond, and they evaluate the threat in different ways. And that's the argument I make in the book.
So next, Kunal.
Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating talk. Just, so this is always a problem doing case studies. So finding in real world, finding comparable cases is very difficult. And so there is significant differences between the two cases that you discussed today. So in World War II, there is both an air threat from the bombers as well as a rocket threat. The rocket threat, and you can compare those two. In Gulf War, there is no comparable air-based threat from Saddam Hussein, and therefore the only thing they're worried about is the Scud missiles. In World War II, that's not the case. In World War II, rockets are also a newer thing, so it's a novelty of the threat that is playing a lot of role here. And the second, this is the only threat, and Israel is a small state, a safe haven for Jews, which takes its any tiny bit of security very seriously. So it's not strictly comparable. So how do you deal with that challenge?
So World War, the Germans were using V1 and V2. They didn't have the capacity to exert air power over Britain. Right? So the only way they could have used, or only way they could have bombarded the British was through V1, V2. At that point, around 93, when this happens, the Germans don't have enough pilots and enough fuels to go fly into Britain, and they were trying to distribute the limited air resources to do homeland defense. So there was no alternate means to do it. So this was the only way to do it at that point in time. But again, it's case study driven, so comparisons have limits. But I'm arguing against that.
Wright Smith.
Hello, Wright Smith. I'm curious. So one thing that we know about the Germany case, I'm going to ask a case-specific question that I'll expand out, is we know the Germans themselves diverted a lot of industrial resources into the development of the V1s and V2s, which could have gone to either other aircraft or air defense capabilities, or even tank production or other things they could have used to fight the war. And so, does the state that's using this strategy also kind of divert itself potentially? And the bigger question I have related to that is this a much more rational strategy for some actors than others? So an actor like Hezbollah in 2006 or the Houthis in Yemen, who don't necessarily have the military industrial capacity to divert into other things, versus a state like Germany that could have used this industrial resources another way.
The answer is yes, right? Simply put, what air force could the Houthis and the Hezbollah have that Israel wouldn't hit and destroy? Missiles may be a better alternative to it. So the German case is interesting, and it really depends on how you're measuring and what you're measuring, right? The industrial effort that went into V1 and V2 arguably could not have significantly shifted the air power. Right? Those decisions that the Germans made on air power, like the bomber program was cancelled, and I can't remember the personality. It's their internal dynamics. They canceled it, right? I mean, that was a decision that completely disabled them from being able to go into UK and bomb the British or bomb the Allied forces. It was not really V1 and V2. So I've heard people make that argument, and the counter has always been, it's not so huge that it could have changed the air power, and I'm partially sympathetic to it. There is also the other story about Hitler jumping back and forth. At one point, he thinks V1 and V2 is great, and then he shuts down the entire program because he thinks it's not great, and then they reactivated it in 1943. So I don't know whether substitution was really the argument against V1 and V2. It may be because it was imprecise enough to win the war against a state fighting for core interests, may be an issue. But you're right, for some actors, it may be a better strategy. I think that's clear. And the Houthis are very consistent in repeating that. Right? I mean, I didn't get into that case study. They consistently say, we will never fight like a regular force. We will fight like a militia force, and rockets are a way to do that.
Ray Posen.
So you're using, in these two motivating cases, diversion as a proxy for the effectiveness of the button that the coercer could push by firing those missiles. So I think you have a case selection problem. And the case selection problem is a simple one. In both cases, the diverter is incredibly wealthy militarily. So though you have some nice narrative there, anybody who's looked at the air power generation in either of those wars is going to scratch their head and say, yeah, certainly affected their decision making, but not that much. The diversion is just not that important. It's not to say the cases aren't interesting or the relationship isn't there, but to find a case that sort of shows your IV really working in a strong way, you'd have to show me a pretty strong reaction in the sense of an operator operating under conditions of great scarcity being forced to divert significant resources from something they really wanted to do. So I guess my question is, do you have a case like that? Maybe you do, you didn't get a chance to talk about all your cases, maybe there's other cases you like more, but how would you react to that?
So thank you for that question. I was at this happy hour yesterday with a bunch of folks, and they said, if Barry Posen isn't asking you a question, your book is really not fun. So, so I'm glad, right? So yes, so there's two parts to that question, right? One is there's at least two ways to measure what I think you're getting at. One is highly resource constrained adversary actually making the diversion, or the diversion itself becomes so costly that even if it's not resource constrained, the target state says, well, enough is enough, I don't want to go there, right? So the first one I don't. They have a case study because Iran-Iraq war comes close. The Iranians at the end of 87, 88, when Saddam Hussein is able to target Tehran and says, no, I'm going to do chemical weapons, they were so resource constrained and they were tired enough that they just say, enough is enough. Right? I mean, I'm going to sign this UN treaty, but there is no diversionary effect in that case study. They couldn't do anything. Their Air Force couldn't suppress the threat. From what I can see, they didn't attempt a lot. But they did they feared the threat, and that was part of the reason why they decided to concede. So that first question is tough. I don't have a case study where the resource was so constrained that I could still observe the diversion. But the other two case studies, the Israelis in 2006 with Hezbollah and the Saudis in with the Houthis, there I think there's something to be said, especially the Saudi Houthi case, right? They begin very high. In fact, there's this, the way I start that chapter in the book is Mohammed bin Salman has this conversation with the director of the CIA, and he makes this statement, and I can't remember which director of the CIA, but the statement essentially begins like Mohammed bin Salman saying, I'm going to take care of the Houthis in 2 weeks, then I'm going to go do something in Lebanon, right? And in the book, I think it's John Brennan who says, I don't know what this guy was smoking, but it must be really good. So they begin this huge effort, and they do divert, right? And by the way, the Houthi missiles is called the flying lawnmowers. It wasn't precise. It wasn't modern. Their drones were good in terms of precision, right? So there's huge diversion. They do scud hunting. And again, American troops are in Saudi Arabia trying to do it. But over time, all their Patriot batteries go down. Right? They don't have interceptors. Their oil facilities are getting hit with drones. And then they have to go ask the Europeans for Patriots. So you can slowly see in that case study how their resources are getting diluted. It's never completely done. At some point, they essentially at the 7th year of the war, they say, well, we will never strike a deal with the Houthis. By the 7th year of the war, oh, the Houthis are a legitimate power. And that part of that story, while there's land combat also happening, this air bombardment, this terrorism punishment strategy kind of chips away at the resolve. So that I can prove in those case studies in 2006 and the Houthis in Yemen, that by continuously bombarding and accepting a higher cost or pain than what the other side is willing to accept, you slowly use these weapons to pull down the resolve. And if core interest is not at play, they will say, okay, I can cut a deal with you. That I can show. I just didn't have time, and I didn't know which case studies to choose. So I thought the 91 Gulf War and the World War II were fascinating. But you're right. In those cases, they could. Right. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So in those two cases, I think it's never resource that ultimately kills, at least in the case studies. It's that the resource spending keeps going on and on. At some point, when the core interest is at not play, they say, well, enough is enough. I've taught them a lesson. I can go back. I think that's 2006 Israel. In the Saudi case, they were like, I don't think I can win this war. So I'm going to re-evaluate or reframe my core interest and say I'm done. So I can observe that effect.
Christine.
Hi, Christine Liu. I'm a third year. I wonder if you can talk more about this emotional response mechanism that you discussed. Is it a background thing that's always there, or is it kind of a variable where under some conditions we expect the political vulnerability that comes from that emotional response or potential response to be higher than others?
Okay. So this question goes to how I wrote the book, right? Again, remember that the crucible had a huge time pressure, and I had to. So again, I was trying to explain, right? I mean, why were they Israelis so worried in the 91 Gulf War? Right? I mean, because they had warning of incoming missiles, they had taken civil defense measures, they had gas masks, and if you actually do analytically see at what chemical weapons can do, unless it's a huge amount, it's not a threat. World War II, same story, and. So the way I went about trying to connect that response to an emotional trigger was to borrow from the terrorism literature. Right? It felt more to me like these countries and these actors were using these aerospace weapons, like how suicide bombing is used to provoke a overreaction from the target state. That would be Bob Pape's second book argument, right? These actors use suicide terrorism as a trigger. So that was my connective point. Since Nina Crawford's IS article, there's a stream of literature that tries to think about how emotions influence IR, right? And which emotion, again, becomes a big question. So it seemed to me the emotion in these cases were fear. Right? Fear of what could happen, not what will happen. Right? That theoretical argument essentially says if you're operating under fear, two things should matter. Your appraisal tendency, your probability neglect should be high. So you should estimate the threat much higher than what you would normally do, and your action tendencies should be skewed, meaning you would try and fight back. So that's the way I did that. And then I said, well, I can't measure emotion explicitly, which is very challenging, but is there appraisal action tendency skewed? Is there an internal fight? If someone says this missile is irrelevant, is there someone saying, no, you don't get that, I get to say that, right? I mean, it's irrelevant because you're sitting in a bunker, but what if my kids go to school and one falls, right? So that appraisal tendency gets skewed. So I measured those two things as a proxy for fear. How are they appraising the threat, and how are they deciding to acting on the threat? And if that is not linearly logical, then I can argue that fear does some of the work. That's how I framed it. But does that answer your question?
Yes, and also whether it varies based on conditions.
So that was tough to measure, right? Again, data becomes an issue. The Israelis don't release a lot of data too, right? I mean, so 2006, again, did they fear more than they feared in 1991 Gulf War? I think I can argue that there was fear at play. I don't know if it was more or less. It's a measurement problem that I couldn't solve.
So one question that occurred to me is, in the cases you presented, the missiles are often a secondary source of air power. If we look at Ukraine-Russia war today, right, the drones and the missiles that are a much more dominant form of air power. And so does the prevalence of these systems change your theory? And sort of more generally, like, what would your theory say about the Ukraine-Russia war?
Yeah. So the theory is weak actor based, right? I mean, ideally, you'd want to have what Bob Pape wants, is have superiority, massive bombing, and trying to force a reaction. So, and the book is very clear, this is a weak actor strategy, right? In that case, Russia may come, or conceivably could be argued as a weak actor because it's not able to project air power, right? So in this case, Ukraine is subjected to bombardment. And what I would expect is for the Ukrainians to divert resources and then eventually be unable to do more diversion and try to settle. So that's what the book would, in essence, predict. I don't think that's happening, right? And the diversion, the provocation diversion does play out. And I've heard reports about Ukrainians having to choose between defending cities in frontline troops, and they have actually defended cities at the cost of frontline troops. They have made that painful choice. Now, if whether Ukraine will cut a deal depends on whether their core interest is seen at play. My guess is at this point, I think they are seeing it as their core interest to not cede ground to Russia. But if that evaluation changes, then we'd have to see how much of this particular Russian aerospace bombardment played a role in it.
But if Ukraine is the weak actor, and they're also trying to target, Moscow, various facilities, most, oil refineries, weapons depots, like, what would you, like, how do you sort of, like, how do you explain the Ukrainian approach?
The Ukrainian, I'm sorry, should I?
Finger in the back? You want to jump in on this, Polina?
Yeah, not an expert on aerial weapons. Polina Berekova, postdoc in Russian foreign and security policy here at MIT SSP. As I was listening to your fascinating presentation, especially the targeting of MIT SSP building, never felt safer.
It's actually the misty side.
I was thinking that, like, your argument rests on the assumption that the weapon is not very precise. But Taylor's question about Ukrainian use of drones specifically, they are pretty precise. They can actually be used to achieve battlefield goals other than psychological influence. So I think, or the coercion or deterrence or whatever psychological effect you're modeling. So I think your argument in case of Ukraine does not squarely apply because there is one tacit assumption that the weapon is not precise enough to achieve other battlefield objectives, so we'll use it for psychological effects like we saw in the Gulf War or with the foul bombs. So, yeah, that's my.
We have one more two finger on this, Raymond.
Yeah.
This is Raymond. I'm a PhD candidate here. This dovetails into my one finger.
Ah.
The two finger is the sneaky three finger.
Yes.
This marks the day when Taylor lost his power.
All right. Yellow card. All right. Go ahead.
Right. So on this question of like, is it so arbitrariness seems to be doing a lot of work in provoking fear.
The what is doing what?
Arbitrariness.
Okay.
The fact that like
Inaccuracy.
or inaccurate, yeah.
Yeah.
So like, but is it the technical sort of randomness that is doing the work, or is it like what the strike tells you about your adversary that is doing the work, right? Like, is it so in a thought experiment, right? Like, if you had very, very accurate missiles, but are used in a very arbitrary way by like a crazy commander or like a drunk. Right? This has happened historically, right? Like drunk commanders just ordering each other in private cities, right? Like, would that, like, what type of arbitrariness is doing the work in your theory?
Okay. So the accuracy point is valid, right? I mean, the case study, the accuracy does get better, but it's never this massive, huge accurate volume, right? I mean, so by design, I think the theory does have a scope condition on that. I don't know, I have to go back and check on the Ukrainians and how accurately they are doing it. But then if it's used as an accurate military denial weapon, then that goes back to Pape's theory. I mean, again, then you have a lot more weapons at play. I mean, you have to consistently do tactical military denial to create battlefield outcomes, right? I mean, I'm saying when you don't have that means, you can rely on imprecise weapons to provoke an overreaction and therefore hope that overreaction leads to some sort of bargaining arrangement. That's the argument I am trying to make. So I don't know if it's arbitrariness. It's just precision is not a variable, right? In the way I talk about this, you don't have to be precise to do terror punishment campaigns. If you can precisely hit city at 10-kilometer ranges, I think it will produce the same effect. There's a whole bunch of.
All right, now I've got. Are these legitimate two fingers? All right, so
tacticians coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah. This is so Eric, and then Phil, then back to you.
But I guess in kind of Jay's defense, right? Even if these missiles are incredibly precise, right? There is still some diversionary effect, right? It's not operating through an emotional mechanism, but there is still potential diversion, right? If I'm the Russians now, I'm going to concentrate on bombing Ukrainian launch sites potentially, as opposed to other targets. So I think you can. So Barry disagrees.
They're Russians. They don't care.
They're going to bomb everything. Sorry, if they're a rational actor, right? You're still going to have some diversionary effect, but just not through the emotional mechanism and provocation mechanism that you described.
And I haven't seen the Russian response. I don't have the data. I mean, I'm not dodging the question. I don't know. And I don't know how impactful it's been. I have to go look at what the Russians are saying. And the answer may be that Putin is saying, I don't care how many die. So I'd expect a similar reaction, but I don't know what the threshold is for that reaction to kick in. And I have to see the data on the Russian response. I haven't seen anything that would lend more credence to my theory or weaken it. That's two fingers.
Jay, love the presentation. I keep thinking about your theory. This emotional response is very Duhayan in the sense of terrorizing populations. So I can see how that could elicit an emotional response, but there's not a connection between the population to the decision makers, which it may or may not be an emotional response, which makes me think of your cases. The two cases you have are democracies, so maybe regime type has some impact. Of course, you have Saudi Arabia, you have an authoritarian regime. Maybe that reaction is different, but it seems to me that regardless of regime type, regimes have sovereignty over their territory, and anytime, and particularly over a monopoly over violence. And so anytime any outside entity threatens that monopoly over violence, you would expect some type of reaction, so long as you have the capability to do that. Because in your example of Britain, you kept V1 and V2 together. There was no defense against V2. You couldn't even hear it coming. So V1, even though it was militarily less effective, had more of a terror impact. but the British could actually mount a defense against that, so they actually did. They didn't mount defenses against the V2 other than the strikes to take down the launches. So.
All right. You can comment or we can move on.
Oh, no. I think Phil read multiple drafts of my work, and I'm profoundly grateful for what he's done and helped me do it. So again, I remain very thankful. Despite the multiple flaws, I think the book is in a better shape because his expertise floated. But so that's a good point. And again, again, he raises an interesting question, right? I mean, people can be terrified, but how does that percolate up to decision makers? And I struggled with that question, right? And I kind of engaged with it. So in my mind, these are like, why was 9/11 a national event, right? I mean, why is October 7th so nationally terrifying for the Israelis? The 9/11 example would be, well, if I live in Lubbock, Texas, right, 9/11 shouldn't have been as terrifying, but somehow there is certain events that have this emotional national characteristics, but I could only say that much, and then I assume that when there's enough pain, leaders respond to it, and which is why the 91 and the World War II is interesting. There are evidences where Churchill says, you know, people, he actually goes to the parliament and says people are complaining and I need to do something about it. So those small instances of data points give some credence that there is a mechanism that connects the pain of people to its leader, but it's a thin mechanism, and I didn't spend a lot of time trying to fix that mechanism. If I had more time, that's where I would have done an experimental large study. I didn't. And so I assume that that mechanism happens. If it happens, then how does the appraisal action tendencies work? That's where I put in a lot of effort. But that's a great point. It's worth digging more deeper and trying to figure out how and under what conditions that mass pain translates into decision makers sharing of that pain. I don't have a great answer. I acknowledge that question. Great one.
Catherine Dura.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I'm a fourth year PhD student, and I'm picking up on something that Kunal brought up of like how much of this is partially at least an emerging tech story, because just thinking about the potential mismatch of how effective the weapons are and like the impact of the unknown on decisions to divert resources. And so especially since you also have cases on drones, I guess I was wondering how much you think emerging technologies plays a role in this kind of the fear and then diversionary resources versus the more standard weapons of missiles where we have more information.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that question. Right. So again, Russia, Ukraine would be a nice case study, and I am observing that. Right. So if precision should shift the strategy, the Russians have used some really precise weapons against the Ukrainians. Right. The KH-11, Kinzhal, hypersonic, high precise, and there's a whole bunch of things, but they don't seem to be doing a lot of counter military targeting. They still seem to be doing terrorism punishment campaign, right? I don't know if that's because the Ukrainians got really good intelligence and the Russians are unable to do it, or if the Russians are actually making a choice that if I can't have air superiority and I can't have persistent bombardment, punishment, terrorism is a better way for me to use my weapons. So that's would be one case today I would look more for more data to see if that changed. But again, from World War II to the Houthi Hezbollah, there is some variation in position. Right? I mean, World War II is 7.5 miles. I mean, that's not precise. That's precision was on the Delhi World War II accuracy would be Mount Everest, right? I mean, it's so wide, but it still had an effect. So I don't know how precision is going to alter. I need more case studies. Russia, Ukraine would be interesting. The Red Sea shipping denial would be another interesting case study that the Houthis are now doing as part of their provocation targeted Israel and American forces. Again, my understanding is the Houthis aren't precise. Right? They're just persistent and able to suffer a lot of pain. So I'd like more data. It's possible precision does shift the theory. I have to see.
One thing we would always like more data. So.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Jim Walsh.
I enjoyed the talk very much, and I want to talk about something that wasn't the focus of the talk, but has come up, which is sort of the micro theory about emotion. And you framed it in terms of fear, And that makes me wonder, I mean, do we have wars where there aren't fear? Don't the bombs being dropped or the soldiers shooting guns, that causes fear? So how are we to distinguish if aerospace weapons have this particular quality about them, but the other forms of munitions don't? Is it fear? Or maybe in one of your quotes with Churchill, I think it says, and it's an odd argument, but he seems to be suggesting, or I might have misread it, that it's something about the inhuman nature of the instrument, that planes are driven by pilots and there's glory associated with that. Missiles could come anonymously in large numbers, or is it newness? This is the emerging technology question here. But fear would be insufficient, I think, I'm guessing. And the other, once you locate whatever that is and disaggregate the real mechanism, newness, whatever, that'll tell you about what to expect over time or with follow-up cases. Like we had an April attack, Iran missiles to Israel. That was one response. I think we'll get a different response this time. Whereas you could argue newness would have been the thing that would cause a bigger response the first time. I don't know, but you have a field of things where missiles have been used and there haven't been responses, like Iran attacking Pakistan with a ballistic missile. That might be one area of sort of investigating where there's effect and where there's not effect. Or looking at terrorism or some analogous, maybe it's emerging technologies. When do they have the impact they do psychologically? When they don't. So I'm just trying to create lots more work for you.
Yeah, more case studies. I mean, I like the argument. I need to do more case studies. So Carnegie should give me $1 million in 2 years. Second book and papers. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great point. Right? Again, I struggled with it. My decision to group it under fear was, I think it was Eisenhower or someone else. Right? I mean, essentially the argument is I can't shoot the bastard who's bombing me, so that scares me more than it's silent coming down, and those kind of arguments keep coming back and forth. But I don't think it's distinct. Right? Fear could be modulated by newness, by over time. I mean, if you're exposed initially, you are more fearful, and then you get used to it. Those are all fair arguments to make. I acknowledge that in the book.
Eric.
Jay, thanks so much for the talk. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about this kind of civil-military relations when this called the diversion decision is made, right? In all the cases, it seems like the civilian masters order some kind of diversion. But even in the two cases that you have here, there seems to be some variation, right? You have this Horner and Schwarzkopf case where they're quite upset with this guidance. In the British case, maybe just because they're British and more gentlemanly, they seem to be slightly more on board with this. So do you see variation across the cases and kind of what, if any, resistance there is from the military? Because that seems to matter, right? If the military is able to push back in a certain degree, right, maybe this diversion doesn't necessarily happen. So can you speak a little bit more about that relationship?
Sure. Right. And the reason I chose to, again, talk about those two case studies was data was very clearly present on the civil-military tension, right? I mean, the appraisal tendencies were clearly skewed by political decision makers. So the World War II case, it was a very similar story, Eric. So the British wanted us, and the American American military leaders were constantly complaining to Eisenhower, right? I mean, what are they doing? I mean, why are the British forcing us to do it? And Eisenhower constantly overrules them. So some of that kind of plays out in the 2006 Israel Lebanon war, right? The other two case studies, I don't have data, right? I see them diverting. Iran-Iraq war, there was no diversion, but in the Yemeni case, there is diversion from the Saudis, but the internal documentation isn't strong enough to show that. So the Lebanon case, it's interesting, is initially the Israeli Air Force believed that it had successfully suppressed a huge amount of rockets, right? And there's actually a statement where they are going back to the political leaders and saying the job is done. And then they learn that it's not done. And then as the war unfolds and then the resolve gets diluted, at one point, I think I talk about the military leadership saying, there's no more utility in actually going and hunting rockets, right? I've bombed all I can, now I'm just hitting empty targets and I'm not getting the benefit. That's where the decision to use ground forces kicks in. So again, there's that civil-military debate about in the 2000 war about what the weapons can do and what you can do with counterforce that happens. That feeds into the appraisal tendency. So those are the 3 case studies I see them. In some ways there's variation between how political leaders judge the threat to be and how military leaders judge the threat and the response to it. It is?
Important by like Saunders' work and the ability of senior advisors to push back or appreciate decisions.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got 3 folks left on the list. I'll just ask all 3 of them to ask their questions and come back to you. So JJ, Eric Sand, and Ben Harris.
Thank you. So I know this is a conventional story, right? You're focusing mostly on conventional coercion, but we do live in a nuclear age. And the ultimate weapon of coercion for weaker parties is nuclear. So what would your theory say about, or what insights do you have about the effects of nuclear coercion? And if I may sneak in a second question.
No, you may not. I am reestablishing authority that was sadly atrophied. I didn't say restore deterrence. Eric and then Ben.
So my question was sort of dealing with this a little bit about this fear mechanism, particularly the difference that you highlight in your evidence between bombing raids and missiles, which I thought was really interesting. So to ask my question, I'm just going to throw out 2 more hypotheses that we haven't yet thrown out today. One is that there's some sort of threshold, and once you cross that threshold, the effect is the same, no matter how far you go above. So it seems out of proportion with missiles. It doesn't seem out of proportion with the bigger bombing grenades. And the other is related to that, and that's Stalin's quote, right, that 1 death is a tragedy, but 1,000 are a statistic. And so once the raid is sufficiently large, it's not driven by fear. You just have to figure out how to live with it. But when it's small and random, it's actually this much more emotional.
Yeah.
Great. Ben.
So again, thank you for the presentation. My question is again about something that seems like unique about the 2 cases you brought up, which is that in each case, the primary military power wasn't actually the target. It was their weaker ally, and their civilian population was the target. And so in this case, it seems like the targeted country could recommend diverting greater numbers of resources because they weren't diverting their own resources. They were asking their ally to divert resources. And in each case, the ally had a major strategic interest in accepting the dictates of its smaller ally. Like in World War II, it's well documented the US did several suboptimal military things to placate the British. And in the 1991 war, like Israel wasn't even a party to the conflict, and the US wanted to keep it that way in order to keep the coalition together. So it seems like in your cases, the alliance management is doing potentially a lot of the lifting, assuming that the United States did divert major resources in both cases.
Okay. All right.
Great. So
how many
back
minutes
to you
do I
for
have?
how many minutes you have?
Or seconds?
2.5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. I'll
take the time you need.
All right. Sounds good. So the first question. So Saddam Hussein, and in both the 91, the Iran-Iraq war was chemical weapons threat, right? I mean, so there is a WMD angle in that. And so 1991 Gulf War, he doesn't use chemical weapons. In the Iran-Iraq war, he does use it on the battlefield. And his threat is now I'm going to come and smoke out residents of Tehran, right? So I do, in the book, well, the peer review process essentially posed the question you did, right? I mean, it all conventional data said, what do you do with WMDs? And the peer reviewer, he or she was also exceedingly kind to tell me what I should do. And, should say, well, in WMDs, the potential to pose a threat and provoke a reaction would be higher, right? Which probably explains why the 91 Gulf reaction was so high. So it wasn't nuclear specific, it was chemical. And then if it worked much more higher for chemical, then conceivably a nuclear threat would trigger that particular similar response.
Similar response as in like overreacting, trying to deny the other side's use of WMD.
Yeah. Speculatively, I mean, so the 91 was chemical weapons, Iran-Iraq was chemical weapons. So I presume if you threaten now, I'm going to launch a nuclear weapon, it's going to it's going to provoke, it's going to trigger a provocative reaction, a diversionary effort. Whether that is exceedingly high to completely destroy the country, I don't have a data point to talk about it, so I can only speculate, and that's what I did in the book. The threshold argument, that was the second question. It may be true, and in fact, prospect theory may be at work, right? I mean, you're beginning at the war and you lob a few missiles and you say, stop fighting with us, and then we'll stop lobbing the missiles. This was 2006 in the Lebanon war. Right? Now, if you fast forward back to what's happening now, they've actually exercised the entire threat that the bargaining leverage may be very trivial. Right? I mean, all the people have moved back, 60,000, 70,000. So that phenomena may actually be playing out, and it may be true. So there is, in fact, a very careful caveat to the increase in threat slowly over time to bargain. But now that the Hezbollah forces have completely exercised their threat variable, they probably don't have that much leverage. But there are other factors playing out there. So again, we have to see until how the case comes out. The third question was the two cases I talked about unique in some ways because of the ally-alliance relationship. It is, right? I mean, the other cases don't have that problem. But although I point out that at least in the Israel case, I would have, or one could argue that the Israelis should not have actually pushed for it, right? Because here we are, the Israelis have this ideal setting. The American forces are doing for Israel what they would like to do to Saddam Hussein, right? So why would they try to intervene, break up the coalition, and stop the Americans from blowing up everything Saddam Hussein could use to threaten them, right? I mean, so what they posturing? I mean, that's a possibility. But at least in the 1991 case, they were scrambling the jets at least a few times to breach into Saudi airspace. That I thought the only reason they would want to break up this coalition is because they are reacting to a need to have Israeli bombs fall on Saudi trucks. In my view, the argument would have been to keep the pressure on the Americans, but not so much that the whole thing could break down. So I don't think that's a weak test. I think that's a tougher test. But you're right. In those two cases, there is that alliance issue. And I could only find 5 cases with good data, so I used them to frame and scope. It's the data problem again. Right?
Well, I think we've been sufficiently provoked. So thank you very much for coming today and for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much.
So I was